Hello students, Professor Benavides here. Let's go over chapter 1. First of all, I want to talk to you about the structure of these chapters. The way these chapters are built, they each have objectives at the very beginning, then they have content, then they have some hands-on exercises. And in a way, these hands-on exercises are kind of like part of the content. So you're kind of not finished understanding the chapter until you go through the hands-on exercises. Now, you may not be assigned these hands-on exercises, but you should go through them to understand the ideas of this chapter. After the hands-on exercises, you have a summary. This summary is really important. It puts everything together for you, followed by some questions. True and false, multiple choice questions. The answers are provided as well. And they're a great way to find out how well you're understanding the material. And then lastly, each chapter ends with some assignments. Remember, assignments are a little bit more open-ended, and they're typically the ones that will be assigned by your professor. So that's the big picture. Let's go over a few ideas in this chapter. So this particular chapter is going to zero in on Java. You remember that the previous chapter, chapter 0, was about Alice. So, and I'm going to go ahead and mix some live code in here. It involves a little bit of theory. First of all, it talks about what a computer program is. So a computer program is a way to tell a computer what to do. Okay, they're line by line instructions. That's what a computer program is. The computer really only understands zeros and ones. Okay, a binary digit. A byte is represented by 8 bits. Okay, so one character, such as the letter A, is a byte. It takes 8 bits to represent that. Now this story goes on and on and on, and it'll make more sense as you look back on your class. So programming languages are divided into low-level languages and high-level languages. So examples of low-level languages are machine language and assembly language. These are languages that are closer to the metal, right? High-level languages look like English, and they include things like Java, Visual Basic, C++. So each computer language has their own syntax or rules for the language. And Java is a high-level programming language with a specific vocabulary and specific rules for using that vocabulary. So what is the history of Java? So back in 1990, James Gosling was given the task of creating programs to control consumer electronics. Gosling and his team at Sun Microsystems started designing their software using C++, and they found that it wasn't suitable. Okay, so he went and came up with something called Oak. Later on, they found out that Oak was copyrighted, so that shifted to something called Java. And then finally, in 1993, the Java team realized that the Java language they had developed would be perfect for web page programming. So it started, piece by piece, getting, a very broad utilization. So the team came up with web applets, small programs that could include web pages and create a complete browser, called Hot Java. So these are just historical elements. Java, you can create a lot of things with it. And in the second quarter of 1995, now that's an important date to remember, 1995, Sun Microsystems officially announced Java. It's a new language, or this new language was quickly embraced as a powerful tool for developing internet applications. But it's really a very general purpose programming language. It can be used to create many different kinds of applications. So Java has many capabilities. Some of the features of Java, I'm not going to point out all of them, is that it's object-oriented, okay? It's platform independent. A lot of this stuff won't make sense till you look back on the class, but let me just give you a rough idea, is that platform independent means that you can go ahead and run it on different operating systems, okay? And object-oriented programming is the paradigm today for programming. It's based upon the idea that an object is created from a class. So every object has attributes, in parentheses, data, and behavior, in parentheses, methods. And that will become more meaningful as we move along. So Java really has become a very general purpose language. You can do many things. You can create applets and applications and servlets. So Java is secure. Java can contain multi-threads of execution, which enables programs to handle several tasks simultaneously. It has multimedia capabilities. It has garbage collection. And a lot of these things, I'm sorry, if you're a complete beginner, you know, what in the world is this? It just has to do with the idea that memory is taken care of without you having to mess with it from a programming point of view. Believe it or not, other programming languages have to deal with that. So Java's reliable, robust, and it is different than JavaScript. Let's make a distinction here that the Java language was developed by Sun Microsystems and is a full programming language that can be used in many different kinds of applications. Okay, so what's the programming process? We've got to start off with talking about what an algorithm is. And an algorithm is a set of steps that you go through to solve an equation. Yes, we stole that from the math, people. So we've got to be focused on the problem. And when we do that, we many times develop flowcharts, storyboards, pseudocode to represent a solution to the problem. So we're going to use NetBeans, as you remember, and NetBeans is an IDE, an integrated development environment, and it's used to help us write our Java code. So that, for example, when we type in something incorrectly, syntactically incorrect, we'll know right away. When we create a Java application, let's say that we create a Java application called Hello World. When we do that, inside of NetBeans or using NetBeans, it creates a folder structure that we need to be familiar with. Now, just because we're familiar with this structure here, doesn't mean that you're going to be having to drill down on this as a beginner. For right now, you just need to realize that when you create a NetBeans project, that will create a folder that will have a build folder. And inside the build folder, it'll have classes. It'll also have a very special folder called the SRC folder. And your code that you write as a programmer is going to be in this SRC folder or the source folder. Once we compile it, it's going to create a file that ends in CLASS, and that will end up being in the build folder. So to repeat, the code that you write as a programmer is going to be in a file that's in the source folder, SRC folder, and it's going to end in a JAVA extension. Whereas once you compile the code, it's going to end up with a CLASS file, and it's going to end up in the build folder. So Hello World is a project that everybody starts off with. It has historical significance. And when we compile, basically what we're doing is we're converting that source code into something the computer can understand. So remember that story at the beginning of the chapter, that the computer only understands zeros and ones? That's why we have to compile our source code. So source code is what you type in as a programmer. And if you're using high-level language like Java, it resembles English. Your commands look like English. So you end up with this thing called bytecode. So bytecode It's a set of instructions that look a lot like machine code, but are not specific to any one processor. So when we compile the hello world.java, it creates a file that ends in CLASS that's located in the build folder. Have you heard that enough times? It's important to understand this structure, okay? So we're able to, when we run this is sent to the JVM or the Java virtual machine. And the Java virtual machine gets installed when you install the bundle. Remember the software that you installed? You installed the Java NetBeans bundle. That included not only Java with the SDK and the JVM, but it included the NetBeans IDE. So the JDK is the Java Development Kit. It includes the Java library. That's all the classes that you can use to do what you need to do. It's kind of like our tool chest. You know, it's what programmers need to be aware of in order to program. So the JDK includes the Java library, the JVM, as well as the Java compiler. So the version of NetBeans that you install included the JDK. Why? Because we installed a bundle, included two things. She goes on to talk about how you can check to see what version of the JDK you have by checking help from about. So maybe we should go ahead and start doing a little code right here. Let's build this hello world thing and just put in that one line of code that is so historic. You know, it goes back to the days of C, and you can go ahead and look it up. It's a very important thing to know as a programmer. But we're going to go ahead and compile it, and hopefully, if we have no syntax errors, it'll get compiled into bytecode, and then we will have output. Otherwise, we may end up having a bunch of red to look at, and we'll have to go ahead and fix those problems. Okay, so let's just go ahead and do that real fast. I'm going to go ahead and start NetBeans up. And I'm going to do the very similar. I'm going to create the hello world that she just did, and we're going to put in that one little line of code, and we're going to go ahead and look at the structure as well. Okay, so to create a project, I'm going to go ahead and in NetBeans, I'm going to go to File, New Project, Java Application, Next. I'm going to put in the name of this project, and it's Hello World. Notice how I started with a capital H and a capital W. Notice how the default is in the NetBeans project folder. I'm going to change that. Now, this is just a little demo. I'm going to go ahead, but I'm going to go ahead and still store it in the chapter. I'm going to store it in the assignment section, even though it's not really an assignment section, just for practice, okay? So I'm going to go to Browse, and if you remember, I put the folder on the desktop. I called it Learning Java, and I have assignments and exercises. And the hands-on exercises are really, in a sense, very much a part of the content of the chapter. Don't consider it as something extra. It's something that you should eyeball. If you don't type it in, preferably you should type it in. That's why it's called hands-on. That's why they're called hands-on exercises. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in chapter 1 and click open. And then the next thing that she typically talks about here is not having a package statement. And for right now, let's just think of a package statement as a folder that you put stuff in, and we're not going to need to have it because we're only going to have one class anyway. And it's going to be a requirement in this class not to have a package statement. So the way you do that is you get rid of everything to the left of the period, including the period down here below. So that the name of the project is the same name as the main class. Clicking finish. So that brings us here to our Hello World project. And I'm going to go ahead and, well, I'll check what she talked about. Remember, she said, go to help, go to About, and down over here, she wanted us to check. Here you can see what NetBeans I have. Here you can also see what Java I have installed on my computer. Okay, clicking in close, on close. I'm going to go ahead and type in that one line of code, and I'm going to type it in. Well, let's just type it in one time correctly and then one time incorrectly so that we can see that syntax error that she's talking about. I'm going to the end of this comment and just pressing enter. And I'm going to go ahead and yes, I'm going to use a shortcut to make life easier myself. It's if you type in S-O-U-T and press the tab key, it puts that in for you. That only works in NetBeans. And I'm going to type in hello world. And I put in a little exclamation, right? So I'm going to go ahead and run it now, and we'll see the output down below, hello world. Okay? Now let me go ahead and do this one more time. I'm going to type in the code, and I'm going to make a small mistake. And she does the same thing, something similar to this later on. Okay? There may be multiple things wrong with this line. Now, if you run it, you're going to get some errors. Now, notice I had, since this was interpreted as well as compiled, I was already getting alerted to the fact that I had some problems. Now, sometimes when you point to these problem areas in red, you'll get a clue as to what to do. Like right there, it says I need a semicolon. Great. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to add that semicolon. A little bit of problem solving going on. Then I'm going to point to the silly thing again. And it says package system does not exist. It's confused, or it's not giving me the best syntax possible. Now, usually what I tell students to do is just type the line in again, but maybe you'll see, oh, that doesn't look like the line above. I need a capital letter. Okay, there's still another problem. Coming over here, cannot find the symbol method print line. It cannot find this. That means it's not in the library. I spelled it wrong. It should be print line. But you know what some students do? They come over here. You know that L? Some people like to put in a 1. Do you think that's going to go ahead? And the bad part about that is it makes the debugging hard on some people. And you call your neighbor over and you say, look at this code. I don't know what's wrong with it. I said, well, it looks right to me. Print line, you know? So I pretty much, you got to be careful with people that want to put in a number for that L. All right? So there we go. 2 lines of code. Let's go ahead and run it again. And we put it in again. All right? So that's some live code. And let's go back to the book. But before we go back to the book, I'm going to drill down on the folder structure here. Now you're able to see a little bit of the folder structure here on the left-hand side. Each project is represented by the little coffee symbol, and you're able to expand and collapse. The previous projects that you've worked on are there unless you close them. Like, for example, the first Java project, if I right mouse click on here, I can click on close. Right? I'm going to go ahead and just minimize this for right now. And what I want to do is I want to go ahead and show you the directory structure, that's going to go ahead and be used that we have in our NetBeans project folder. Okay, so here's my Learning Java through Alice folder, and in here, if you remember, I'm going to double click on here. Remember, I stored this project in exercises and in chapter 1. And there's Hello World. Now, remember in the book, this is what she had us do. Even though she just talked about it, we opened this up and we notice that here's the source folder and here's the build folder. If I open up the source folder, here's my file that ends in JAVA. And remember, we talked about the fact that both the Mac and the PC don't show file extensions by default. So if you're on a PC, you're going to have to go to View and then make sure that there's a check mark there. If I take this check mark off, you're not going to see the file extension. Programmers love to see file extensions. They're not happy unless they see file extensions, okay? So let's go ahead and put that back on there. And I'm going to I'm going to go back up I can click on the up arrow and it'll take me back up, and I'm going to go over to the build folder and then double click on classes. And here it is. Here's the hello world.class. Remember, we said that this is the file that contains the bytecode. It's almost like machine code, and it gives us the ability to go ahead and have platform independence. Okay, so that was something. The folder structure of a NetBeans project is something that all of us need to be aware of and understand what goes where. Later on, when you become an advanced user, you will purposefully drill down on this to get things. But for right now, we're going to be dealing with the projects through NetBeans, and we're not going to really need to drill down on it this way, other than for test purposes, understanding what's in the source folder, right, and what's in the build folder. Okay. So let's go come back to our book and continue from here. So let's talk about documentation. I think we talked a little bit about it last time, but documentation is simply a way of number one, providing some history of what's going on with your program and who did it. Okay, we could have in Java, we can have single line comments or multi-line comments. There are comments also in Alice. It seems out of place here. I know that it seems like this actually belongs in the previous chapter, but we'll just pretend that it's okay. Okay. So what I want to do now is I want to show you how to make a multi-line comment and a single line comment in Java, and then we'll talk a little bit more about errors. We've already talked about syntax errors, but I guess while we're here, I might as well tell you there's runtime errors, and that's when you tell the computer to do something that it can't do yet, or that it can't do, period, like divide by 0. You will get something it's called a runtime error, because your program works just fine until you get to the point where maybe a user enters in 2 numbers and it ends up dividing by 0. It goes into equation, it ends up dividing it by 0. That's called that, and when that happens, your program will crash, right? A logic error is when you have the wrong formula. Like maybe you multiplied instead of divided and stuff like that. That's called a logic error. What is that? That's when your program runs just fine, but guess what? You click on OK, and it's the wrong answer. The bad part about logic errors is that sometimes beginners think that just because it's a computer, it's the right answer. But guess what? If you gave it the wrong formula, you're going to get the wrong answer. Okay? So you got to be really, really, really careful, with that. So for right now, let's just talk a little bit about comments. I'm going to come back. Let's just continue with the little example that we have here. And I'm going to show you an example of general comments, right, or multi-line comments and single-line comments. Now, when you create your Java application inside of NetBeans, you get a default look to it. At the top, you'll notice that it already has multi-line comments, right? So, and here you have a single line comment. What typically people do is typically you'll get rid of these double line comments, or you could edit them and enter in your own. This is the way I like to enter in a multi-line comment. If I put in a slash and then a period and then press enter, it puts in the closing. That way I don't have to worry about closing it, because if you don't close it, then you're going to have problems. Okay, so this is a multi-line comment, and this is typically, well, inside here you'll typically put things like, project, programmer, programmer's name, date, and description, right? Your book may have a slightly different idea, but basically it's the same idea. right? The other thing that we'll do is enter in single line comments. Let me get rid of this here. And to enter in a single line comment, well, you already see one right here. I'm going to align the curly brackets right here so that it looks, a little bit nicer. Aligning the curly brackets is typically just a way of, making things easier to understand visually. Okay. What I could do is understand that this is right here. This is what's called a single line comment. This is called a multi-line comment. If I want, I can go ahead and enter in another one. I'll come to the end of the line of the code and a statement. We're going to be talking about this in just a while, but remember, a statement is a line of code that performs an action. So let me press enter here, and I'm going to enter in another statement. Okay. So I'll just go ahead and put in another statement, right? Well, I'll say, demo of print versus print line. Okay, we're going to be talking about this in a little bit more detail. Might as well bring it out right now. So if I do an S out tab, that gives me print line, right? And that is very different from print. So print does not give you a carriage return line feed. So if I go ahead and run this, and I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this code up here at the top because I don't need it anymore, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and select it and press delete. Right? Okay, let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. So see how it says first and then second, and then you got the green stuff there. Maybe you're not seeing what's going on here. Maybe the effect of this would be better if we did a print first. Well, let's just do prints. Let's do 2 prints and see what happens there. See how they're like they end up being printed. There's no carriage return line feed. Okay, so print line, what that does is it gives us a line feed. It still says first, second, but look at where the build successful ends up being on another line. So if I want to go ahead and do that and there's going to be times where you want print. This is not really clear at this time. It may not be really clear to you. When would you use print and when would you use print line? Typically, you would use print when you want your blinking cursor in an application program, a console application, where you want it on the left-hand side of your prompt. And if you do print line in a prompt, you'll find out that the blinking cursor will end up being on the line below. So many times prompts look better with print than with print line. So it's important that sometimes they don't tell you why, but that's and it's all about design, isn't it? It's what design do you want? How do you want your interface to look? Okay. So let's come back to our book. And so that's comments and errors. So that brings us to statements. And I bled into this a little bit. So the statement is the simplest thing you can do. A Java statement, and there's all different kinds of statements. We're going to learn where there's assignment statements, there are expression statements, there's statements that perform a simple command, like the print line statement here. Print line is a method. You're going to find out that it is a method. In fact, the case on here kind of like gives it away. S starts with a capital, so it is a class. Okay, we have a class package method, and the method has a parenthesis, and we will typically pass an argument to the method. It receives this string, and it will then print that out for output to the console down below. Okay. So here she goes and makes the distinction between print and print line. Pretty much what I was showing you here. Okay. The print line method versus the print. She probably should have shown you that code. She just says you could also use print, but she doesn't show you the code on there. But you just, I guess, imagine it. Well, here it is down here below, right? Kind of like a little bit reversed in the logic there. For right now, we need to understand that the code that we are going to be typing is going to be inside of the main method. So we will also be using coding that will be known as blocks of code. Blocks of code are surrounded by curly brackets. You have an opening curly bracket and a closed curly bracket. That's referred to as a block of code. Okay. And a lot of times students in the beginning classes, they end up deleting their curly brackets. So it's very important that when you're asked to like add something, delete something, that you have your head screwed on right and you don't delete more than what you should delete. So the main method is where we're going to be typing in our code, right? So she continues to add another line of code, and then that brings us to escape codes. Now, what happens here is that there may be times where you'll need to do something, and that something will get the compiler confused. So you have to actually enter in an escape code to make it your code not have a syntax error. That's the basic idea behind escape codes. There are escape codes for new lines, quotes, and your strings. So here's the escape code for new line, tabs, to display the backslash, single quote, and double quote. She shows you an example of that, and it looks really awkward. I know that students, when they first see this, looks really awkward, but the way I tell you to learn this is this way. Type it in without the escape code. Now, the escape code is, you know, right here, okay? It's backslash double quotes. That gives me the first double quotes around the A, and then backslash double quotes. Why do I need this? Well, because if I just put in double quotes here, the compiler's going to get mixed up because it's going to think that you're trying to terminate the string. So a string is what? A string of characters. And this is a string literal because it is in double quotes. Okay? So that is why we have to use the escape code to go ahead and put it in. Okay? Let's go ahead and play around with that a little bit before we go any further and talk about some other topics. I went ahead and put a little bit of code in here in a project that I was working on called Escape Codes. So I'm coming up here, and I'm just going to double click on this file, but this will give me an opportunity to show you this. Sometimes students, when they open NetBeans, they'll see that the project is totally collapsed. See how the project has these plus and minus, a plus sign here? If you expand that, you'll be able to see the contents. But a lot of times it's not. You will need to continue to drill down on this folder structure until you get to your source file. Okay. So let's just look at a few lines of code on here. We're going to talk just briefly about escape codes. And if you wanted to watch a video on this, here's the video on this. And I'll place this code in the class unit overview. You just hold down the control key and point to this, and the video will play. But it just goes over the escape codes. And let's just go over them one at a time here. Like, for example, new line. In this particular case, notice how I have an escape code of \n. I know it looks a little awkward on here, but basically what I'm doing here in this is I'm comparing this format with simply using print line statements. So a series of print line statements is the same thing as doing the \n. Why? Because the \n, we get that with the ln. Okay? So let me just go ahead and run that, and we'll just compare this line by line. So at the very top, you'll notice that you have first line, second line, third line. See how it says first line? How come they're all on separate lines? Didn't I type it in all on one line? I got separate lines because I put a \n. And then I did something that she doesn't talk about here, but it's been around for a long time. It's called the empty string, right? The empty string is simply the print line method, and you just give it the double quotes on here, right? And that what that does is it just gives me this blank line. Now, how could I have done this another way? If I wanted to, let me go ahead and comment this out. See how I can comment a line of code out? I could come over here and put in a backslash here and make this as ugly as I want to. Let me go ahead and run it. You'll notice that I'm going to end up with the same blank line there. Scroll up, and there it is, same blank line. Okay. Then over here, I'm just simply discussing the difference between print and print line as it relates to the backslash and escape code. But what seems very, very different here is the tab. The tab is, it takes a little bit of time to master because tabs usually go to the next column divided by 8. So here we see that I have a header of name, department, and date of hire. And then underneath it, I put Bob. He's in the personnel department, and he was hired on this date. And below that, I put another person. So if you scroll down here, you'll notice that I have these columns now. So what does a tab key do for us? It allows us to align our data. That's what the tab key does, right? And in order to give myself sufficient space for what's inside there, I went ahead and put 2 tabs, okay? Now, what if I need to make a statement that uses the backslash? I can't do that because it's going to think I'm trying to use an escape code. So how do I do that? I do backslash. So let's say I want to say, save your file to C:\\. See the statement down over here? Save your file to C:\\. I won't be able, let me just go ahead and show you what I'm talking about here. If I just get rid of that, I get, since the interpreter sees it right away, it says, no, you can't do that, come on. And it says on close string literal. It's totally confused, right? See, when you get something like that, you may not know how to respond to it unless you understand the escape code. Now, what I usually tell people to do is continue to edit, go back in time until you get to a point in time where your line of code is not in error. So I'll click on backslash again, and notice how, you say, oh my, there's no longer a syntax error there. Why? And I got a syntax error as soon as I typed this in. And that's because that backslash is used only for escape codes. But if I need to type in a backslash, I put in backslash. You got it? Okay. Now, when it comes to putting in the single quote, she didn't go over this really well, but it's really a fine line to distinguish when do I need to use an escape code for a single quote versus a double quote. Okay, for a single quote, I can, if I want to, put in a backslash and it'll work just fine. However, as you can see here, it's not necessary. Why? Because it's okay to have a single quote inside of double quotes. Where it's not okay is to have a single quote inside of single quotes with a char. We haven't gotten over the char data type yet, so this may be, kind of like a, it's just something to just watch on. But basically, the idea is this: if I get rid of the backslash here, which is the escape code, I am trying to put a single quote that's enclosed in single quotes. Very similar to, like, say, for example, if it were to be double quotes. You can't do that. So a char, for the sake of definition here, is a variable that can hold 1 character. So I'm going to put, if I want to put in the single quote in there, and I know this is a very particular situation, but you're going to find out that programming is a lot of really particular typing situations, and you've got to pay attention to this level of detail. Otherwise, you're going to have a real hard time. Okay? All right, so I go ahead and fix it. Then we go on to show you when to use the single quotes versus double quotes. let me show you what I'm talking about here. S out, and I'll just type in the same thing. I will make an A. Let's say I want to just put in the double quotes, right? Why am I getting a an error message here? Sometimes you get lucky and it tells you something. Well, it's not helping out a whole lot here, but basically you should remember that you can't just see what's happening here. Look at this. It thinks you're wanting to terminate the string there. Remember, you really can't understand this unless you understand what a string is. A string literal is text enclosed in double quotes, right? And the double quotes has a beginning and an end. So here it's getting confused. So the only way I can put in the double quotes is to have an escape code at the beginning and an escape code at the end. That may look a little awkward, but what I usually tell people to do is to just go, if you get in an error message, delete it and enter it in, one character at a time, and that should fix you up. Okay, let's come back to the book now. So now we go on to talk about that red line over here. This red line means that you type the line of code and it's so long, guess what? It's not going to print out right. I know a lot of people don't print out a lot nowadays. And NetBeans, if you go file print, she doesn't tell you, to think you know that, it's going to end up on the second page. So typically, we'll go ahead, and what she demos here is she shows you a little, she introduces the concept of concatenation, which is the joining of strings, but she has it done automatically here. Let me go ahead and simulate what she's talking about here. So I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to write a real long line of code. And basically what I'm going to do is just going to copy that and put it in another time and put it in another time. See that? See how I have that little red line now? So what's going to happen here, that it's going to look really awkward when I go to print this, right? If I go file print, I'm going to show you. She just tells you, and I like to just demonstrate for real what file print, and it shows you here your code, and it shows you how it's showing that line of code on the next page, and so it looks really awkward, I think, right? By the way, the printing from NetBeans is not very good. But anyway, you don't get color or anything. So what she has you do is she has you do this. Well, first of all, she said, go and put in a \n, and then go right in front of here and do this. Press enter. And when you press enter, what does it do? It puts in a plus sign, and that's called concatenation. Later on, instead of doing this automatically like what she's showing you here, we're going to be doing this manually. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this again to simulate what she has in the book. Another \n. I'm going to go right in front of it, and I'm going to press enter. So now when I go, now everything is within the red line. I don't have that problem anymore. Like if I go to file print, let's check it. See how everything is in, I don't have that funny page on the right hand side. Okay. So now when I run this, let me go ahead and run this. Scroll down to the bottom here. See how it says this is a real long line of code. This is a real long line of code. What's happening is that each one of these lines is going on a different line because of the \n. Okay, so that's pretty much the chapter. But remember that the chapter goes on to have hands-on exercises, and a lot of times when I lecture over these chapters, I'm going to just cover the content. I need to remind myself that the exercises are really part of the chapter. So you need to go ahead and look at them. Let's just eyeball what she goes over, because she might end up throwing in something extra or really important in here. So she has you walk through how to compile and execute a Java program. So we're just going to go ahead and look at this top level, since we already know how to do this, right? So she has you start a Java application. She walks you through this. That's why it's called hands-on exercises, right? And she has you get rid of the package statement, right? And then she has you make sure that you drill down to the file that ends in JAVA. She has you check the Java JDK. She has you enter in a multi-line comment at the top. And then she goes and explains every single little line of code on here. That we have a main method that's inside the class. We're going to write our code inside of the main method. And she tries to explain this as simply as possible. You know, and yet at the same time, she brings out some really important ideas, such as the fact that the program, okay, that it's public. We may not know exactly what public means, but it means that it's accessible by other programs or other files, okay? The name of the program is Hello World. You know, the class name should begin with a capital letter. This is definitely one of the more important things to learn, even though I think it was a concept that we also spoke about in the previous chapter. So capitalization is really, really important. Then she goes on to define or explain, you know, the statement that it prints out hello world, that system is a Java class. Remember I talked about how if you see a capital letter, that means it's a class. Out is an object on the in the screen, and the out object is the screen. And Java is case sensitive. So when you're typing in this code, if you try to put in a little letter S for system, you're going to get a squiggly. You're going to get, you know, an error message. Okay. So basically, you're going to put the arguments in the parenthesis, and for right now, it's already. We're lucky that when we create our Java project, that all of this code for the main method that's inside of the class gets written for us. We don't have to do that. Back in the good old days, we had to actually type all that in. She goes on to talk about the curly brackets. Really important not to delete the curly brackets. That's why I tell a lot of people you want to align the curly brackets, click on the first one, and it highlights the closing one to make sure that you have not deleted any. Okay? Continuing to go on here, she goes on to talk about the build project. Remember how we were looking inside the code that, you know, that inside of the code we end up, there was a source file, you know, and then the build project is where you have, you know, the class file. And if you get a feedback that says build successful, that's what you want, right? So that your project folder from a structural point of view, you need to understand that the bytecode, you know, is in the build folder, or actually in the classes folder that's in the build folder, and that is that's where the bytecode resides. That's not anything that humans understand. It's bytecodes is an intermediary state. It's kind of like machine language, right? And remember, once you've compiled your program, to repeat this again, you end up with a file that ends in CLASS, okay? And that happens when you click the Run button inside of NetBeans, okay? So the process you've seen so far is typing in a Java program in NetBeans, compiling a Java program and executing a Java program. This is the process that we'll be going through over and over and over as you progress through Java. The output that you have at the bottom of the screen is simply the computer displaying the words, hello world. So here you see she asks you to go ahead and add another line of code. She wants you to put your name on here. And then she's going to ask you to go ahead and do a few more things. she's going to have, as we go through this, she's going to have you close the project by right mouse clicking on the project and clicking on close. I think I've shown you that before. And then she's going to have you open it up again so you're comfortable with the interface. Once you open up the project, you may need to drill down to your Java file, your source file, right? And you know where that is in. It's in the source folder, okay? And if you're looking at it inside of the IDE, you would have to click on the little plus sign. If it's collapsed, you'll see a plus sign next to Hello World. You'll click on that, and then if source packages is collapsed, you'll click on that. So what we're getting here is really important. A lot of students can't find this file called helloworld.java. They open up their file, and that's because when you open up the project, it doesn't open. Sometimes, depending on how you left it, it won't open up to the source file. So you've got to be able to navigate to this file. Once you click on it, then you'll see the code on the right side of your window. You'll be able to see that one line of code or however many lines of code that you went ahead and typed in, okay? So she has you type in something syntactically incorrect. I did something very similar to that. In fact, I even did the same print line. And I also showed you putting in the number 1 for L. Why? Because I see that a lot in my classes. And they're mystified because, hey, look, I'm putting in the LN. I said, well, did you type in the number 1? And they say, yeah. Well, that's why. Okay. So she has you create some errors so that you can go ahead and fix them. Different kinds of errors. Like here you can see in this situation where the string literal that's being passed as an argument to the print line method is missing the opening double quotes, right? The line on line 12 is syntactically correct. Line 11 is missing. Now, how could this happen? Many different ways. Maybe you forgot it, maybe you deleted it, okay? So your job is to type right now is to understand that the lines of code that you're going to type in are going to be in main. Later on, you're going to learn that there's a reason to type it in different places. But for right now, it must occur within the opening and closing curly brackets of the main method, okay? So, it's an iterative process of running, fixing your work, and then she also talks about how you can, sometimes just type misspell things like, hello is not HELO. I mean, there's an L missing. So you could, that kind of a sense is it's kind of like a logic error. Sometimes we just don't, we think that just because we don't get like a red, just because we don't get a syntax error that somehow everything's okay. And that's not necessarily the case all the time. You could have a logic error that you can't see because you're just too close to your code, right? So she talks about the logic errors. She shows you what that looks like. And that's just a real simple. Another example of logic error is when, like I told you, when you put in an equation and you put in where you divide instead of multiply, or you've got the equation wrong. That's a logic error, right? And then she goes on to have you get a little bit more experience with escape codes and closing your application. And then you get another example. I didn't drill down on this as much as I should have in the previous lecture, but the idea here is that these are, even though these may not necessarily be assigned, what they give you is practice. And when you practice, it becomes internalized. You'll be able to go ahead and start a new project right away. You'll be able to understand how to not create a package statement, right away, because you'll have to practice makes perfect on here. You'll put in your documentation, and you'll understand that you were going to write your code inside of the main method. You're going to type it in, hopefully syntactically correct. Here you do a little simple exercise on a little using asterisks to build sort of like a little tree here. It's still a string literal. Remember that in the parenthesis of the print line method, we pass an argument, and we're passing a string literal. This just shows you how you can go ahead and create, a string literal, and she modifies it a little bit by giving, say, for example, she in the first situation here, she has a series of statements that terminate in a semicolon. And let me just stop right here, make sure I understand. Remember, a statement is a line of code that performs an action. In Java, every statement must terminate in a semicolon. And yes, when you're a beginner, people forget to put the semicolon. So here she shows you how you can create this little tree, if you would, using a whole bunch of statements. And then she shows you how you can use concatenation. Remember, concatenation is when you use the plus sign to join strings. Of course, this is an overcomplication, but it does, I guess you're going to have to know by now that just programmers just love to overcomplicate stuff. And why do it simply when you can do it more complicated, right? So she shows you how you can go ahead and use the \n to pretty much create the same thing, and of course fix syntactical errors. She shows you how to close, and finally we come to this summary. I may not be stressing all chapters to this extent, but I want you to understand the structure, which is objectives, contents, hands-on exercises that give you practice, a summary. And after the summary, then you will have some questions. And these questions are really good. And I think that many of you may be seeing them somewhere else. Like what does JDK stand for, etc. You will see the answers to these questions at the end. You may probably want to hide them until you answer all of these questions. And then she has some assignments, which are a little bit more open-ended, free form things that she doesn't go line by line by line with you on. Okay, so that, my friends, is the end of my presentation on chapter 1. As you remember, we had a prefix, which pretty much just gave you an overview of what the book is about. Chapter 0 was all about Alice, and it talked about the interface of Alice, that Alice is a stepping stone to learning Java. And in chapter 1 we talked about Java, and then the chapters to follow will be a mixture of both Alice and Java. Hopefully you're going to be saving to the directory structure that she specified in the prefix, but you don't have to. It's just a way to get organized. See, if you're going to be doing all this practice, remember, you do this practice, you're not going to be, this is for yourself. This is so that this stuff can be internalized. All right? All right, so that's all I have to say about this particular chapter. I want to thank you very much